1 Timothy chapter 1, and I'm reading again from verse 5. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. Now, the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart, and of a good conscience, and of faith unfeigned. You'll see that side by side with the faith is a good conscience. Come back to verse 19. Holding faith and a good conscience. It's saying we hold faith. We have faith. We possess faith. And we keep to that faith, and then in a good conscience. Today we're looking at this message, keeping the faith in a good conscience. Keeping the faith in a good conscience. Keeping the faith in a good conscience. There are three things we're talking about. Number one, the function of every person's conscience. The function of every person's conscience. Number two, the formation of a purged conscience. The formation of a purged conscience. How do you form? How do you enlighten that conscience? How do you edify that conscience? How do you build up that conscience so that it will be the conscience of a Christian, the conscience of a person that wants to get to heaven, the conscience of a person that is seeking the face of the Lord and wants to do right every time. Number three, the fruit of a pure conscience. The fruit, the result of a pure conscience. Number one, the function of a person's conscience. The function of every person's conscience. We're coming back to 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 1. Reading from verse 5 again. Now, the end, the purpose, the reason for the commandment is charity out of a pure heart, and of a good conscience, and of faith unfeigned, which everybody should have, which every Christian should have, and which even the unbeliever should be careful not to tamper with. But look at verse 6, from which some, having swerved, have turned aside unto vain jangling. What's vain jangling? Useless argument. Instead of concentrating on the essentials, instead of concentrating on the non-negotiable, instead of concentrating on the things that will be for the good of man, good of society, and also be for our eventual good to get to heaven, they turn aside from faith and a good conscience, and they turn aside unto vain jangling, useless argument, worthless argument. And they look at verse 7, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm. We're looking at verse 19, holding faith and a good conscience, which some, having put away concerning faith, have made shipwreck. That is, they appear to have been saved. They were born again, they were saved. But now, they do not understand that even after you are saved, you need to maintain a good conscience, because that conscience has a great function. What's the function? Let's come back now to Romans again. We read it before, let's read it again. Repetition makes for emphasis, and repetition also instills, inscribes these things in our minds and hearts so that we'll not forget. In Romans chapter 2 verse 14, for when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. That means on the judgment day, nobody can say, I didn't know. Yes, you knew. I didn't have the reference of the Bible that says, thou shalt not steal. It was in your heart. Thou shalt not covet what belongs to neighbor. It was in your heart. Thou shalt not commit adultery, it was in your heart. And thou shalt not kill, it was in your heart. I wrote that in your heart. You see, many people think if you don't have the tables of stone, you don't have the commandment of the Lord. If you do not have a Bible to read, you don't have the law of God. Yes, you do. Look at this in verse 15, which show the work of the law reaching in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing them. Genesis chapter 6, we're reading from verse 3. Genesis chapter 6 verse 3. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man. You know what that means? My spirit strives with man, but not always. If a person decides, that's the way I'm going to go, the conscience is saying no. Through the Spirit of God, the conscience says you're not going the right direction. But you neglect that. You overlook that. It says a time will come when that conscience will be dead, and then the spirit will not strive with that man anymore, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And many people, they think that those in the Genesis period, that they didn't know anything about the law of God, because Moses had not come. And because Moses had not come, the law had not been given unto them, and so everybody could do whatever they wanted to do. Not really. Look at Genesis chapter 20. In Genesis chapter 20, I'm reading here from verse 6. And God said unto him in a dream, yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thine heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. And that's Genesis. They knew there was sin because Abimelech had taken Abraham's wife. And then God came to him and said, you're a dead man. That woman with you is another man's wife. Genesis. That means it was wrong for them in Genesis to even take another person's wife. And then the man said, I'm righteous. The man told me he is my sister. And then come to verse 7. Genesis. Now therefore, restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. If thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears, and the men were so afraid. Look at this. And Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, what hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom? Tell me. A great sin. Genesis, they knew there was sin. Genesis, they knew there was a great sin. But look at the next sentence here. For you to understand, they have the law of God written in their hearts, that they should not do evil. It says, thou hast done deeds unto me. Tell me the rest. That ought not to be done. And that's Genesis. Genesis is telling us that they had conscience, and their conscience told them this was wrong. You couldn't do that. We're coming to Genesis chapter 37. So I want you to block away from your mind, the idea that all those people at Genesis, at the time of Genesis, after all, they didn't know God, and they didn't know the word of God, and the law of God had not been given. Because the law of God had not been given, that means they were free. No, they were not free. Their conscience told them. We're looking at Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. Here we're reading from verse 8 and verse 9. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master waters not what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. Look at this. There is none greater in this house than I, neither has he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. The latter part of that verse, we're going to read that together. 1, 2, 3, go. In Genesis, look at that. He said, no, you're giving yourself to me. You're offering yourself. I cannot do that. Because if I did that, it will be, number one, great wickedness. Number two, it will be sin against God. How can I then do this great wickedness and sin against God? So you understand that they were in the period of Genesis did not mean that they had no law. They had the law written on their conscience, on their heart. That's the function of the law. Chapter 42. Genesis chapter 42. I'm reading from verse 19. Genesis chapter 42. And here we're reading from verse 19. If ye be true men, Joseph talking to his brothers, let one of your brethren be bound in the house of your prison. Go ye, carry corn for the famine of your houses, but bring your youngest brother unto me. So shall your words be verified, and ye shall not die. And they did so. Look at verse 21. And they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. That thing had happened many years before. More than 10 years before, they had sold Joseph into slavery. And how they came to Egypt, they didn't know they were talking to Joseph. They didn't know that Joseph was still alive. And they were talking to one another, and they were saying, we remember our conscience pricking us. Our conscience is reminding us we did evil because we're very guilty concerning our brother. And in that we saw the anguish of his soul. When they besought us, he was crying, he was pleading. We will not hear. The cries of Joseph more than 10 years earlier came back to their mind. And we will not hear, therefore is this distress come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, speak not I unto you, saying, do not sin. They knew there was sin in the Old Testament. They knew there was sin at the time of Genesis before Moses ever came, because God had planted that conscience in everyone. Do not sin against the child, and ye will not hear. Therefore behold, also his blood is required of us. We're coming to John chapter 8. John chapter 8, and we're reading from verse 7. Here they brought a woman, the religious hypocrites. Here they brought a woman, these Pharisees, these religious people, unto the Lord Jesus Christ. And their goal was not to defend righteousness. Their goal was to accuse Jesus of whatever they wanted to accuse him of. In John chapter 8 verse 7, so when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. That's all he said. He didn't say, you're all sinners, you're all hypocrites, you're all pretenders. He didn't say, you're just religious people and you are not living righteous yourself. All he said is that you want to stone her, that's all right. The law says, whosoever has done this, stone the person. He didn't tell them, you have a log of wood in your eyes and you're looking at the mote in other people's eyes. He didn't say that to them. All he said is, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone. Look at this. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. He wasn't even looking at their faces. He wasn't looking at their eyeballs. He wasn't trying to threaten them. By the way he looked at them, he looked away from them and was writing on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted in their own, tell me the word, conscience. That conscience is never one. Religious, irreligious, hypocritical, sincere, heavenly minded, hell-bent, whoever, the conscience is there. And so as they came to the Lord Jesus, this is the function of the conscience. The function of the conscience, to remind us things are not right. To remind us we're not living right. To remind us that action is not okay. To remind us that thing you say is little, negligible. You know you have a wrong purpose. You have a wrong bent of mind. You know that you're doing that and it's a sinful sin. And you might say to people outside, I didn't know, but you know. But you know, because the conscience is there. These were not believers. These were sinners, and yet their conscience convicted them, and they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the elders. The older people have conscience, and then it goes on to say, even unto the last, unto the least, the young people too, they have conscience. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst.